Whoever recites the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr Ibn Arabi. Before the story begins, pause. Like, comment, and share, because maybe this reminder was sent to you tonight. Ibn Arabi once said, "There are verses whose light enters the heart not as sound, but as presence." Among them, he spoke of the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr, the verses that carry names of Allah so pure, so radiant, that when recited with sincerity, they open a secret window between the heart and the divine. He wrote that these verses are not merely words to be repeated, they are keys. Each name of Allah is a door, and whoever calls upon them in the stillness of the night does not just remember Allah, Allah remembers them. He described one night in Damascus, sitting alone after Isha, the world quiet, his heart heavy with longing. He began reciting the final verses. He is Allah, other than whom there is no deity, knower of the unseen and the witnessed. He is the most merciful, the most compassionate. As his voice filled the room, something changed. The air grew still. The candle's flame steadied. And a light, soft, golden, alive, seemed to glow from within his chest. He later wrote, "The heart is not a vessel of flesh. It is a lamp. And the names of Allah are its oil." He said that whoever recites these verses each night with awareness will feel that same light, not seen by eyes, but known by the soul. It begins as peace, then becomes warmth, and finally becomes recognition that Allah has always been near. Ibn Arabi taught that this practice transforms the heart into a mirror. The more one remembers these names, the cleaner that mirror becomes, until it reflects divine light without distortion. Then, he said, you no longer speak the verses begin to speak through you. He warned his students not to recite them mechanically. Do not count the names, he said, let the names count you among those who remember. He explained that the true power of these verses lies not in the tongue, but in the state of the heart while reciting them. When the heart says, He is Allah, it must also let go of I am. For the light enters only when self departs. From that teaching, his followers began reciting these verses before sleep. And many wrote in their journals that their dreams became luminous, filled with peace, as if the world itself was whispering Subhanallah around them. Ibn Arabi concluded, whoever guards these verses at night will be guarded by light in the day. And whoever carries them in their heart carries a doorway to the unseen. Would you like me to continue to tell how Ibn Arabi explained what that light truly does to a person who recites these verses every night, until the heart itself begins to glow? Ibn Arabi once told his closest student, the one who recites these verses each night will find that the world no longer looks the same. At first, the student didn't understand. But Ibn Arabi smiled softly and said, because the light that enters your heart will start to change what you see, not outside, but within. The next night, under the pale glow of the moon, the student recited the final verses of Surah Al-Hashr slowly, each word trembling from his lips. He is Allah, the Creator, the Fashioner, the Bestower of forms. To him belong the most beautiful names. Whatever is in the heavens and the earth exalts him, and he is the exalted in might, the wise. When he finished, he felt his chest expand, his thoughts quiet, and an unfamiliar peace descend upon him. In that stillness, he remembered Ibn Arabi's words, the tongue may recite, but only the heart understands. Over the following days, the student began to notice small changes. His anger dissolved faster. His fears felt lighter. And when he looked at people, he saw not their flaws but their reflections of the same light he now carried. When he returned to Ibn Arabi, he said, Master, the verses feel alive inside me. Ibn Arabi's eyes sparkled. That is the secret, he said. When the light of remembrance dwells in your heart, Allah Himself becomes your guide. You stop seeking signs, because you become one. Then he raised his hand and said something that his disciples would repeat for centuries. The heart that holds these verses becomes a lantern in the dark. And the one who carries that lantern becomes invisible to despair. That night, Ibn Arabi wrote in his journal, "Every verse is a path. And every path returns to the same door, the remembrance of Allah." He ended the entry with a simple line that has survived through time: recite until the words no longer come from your lips, but from your soul. As the nights passed, the student's devotion deepened. Each time he recited the verses, he felt as though something unseen drew closer, not a sound, not a vision, but a quiet presence that wrapped him in mercy. One evening, he came to Ibn Arabi with tears in his eyes. "Master," he whispered, "when I recite now, I feel my chest glowing as if there's a fire within me, but it doesn't burn. It soothes." Ibn Arabi looked at him for a long moment and replied, "That is not fire, my son. That is Nur, the divine light. It enters gently, but once it settles, it never leaves." He explained that this light was not something to be owned or shown, it was something to be guarded. "You must feed it with sincerity, truthfulness, and dhikr," he said. "Because the heart is like a lamp. Without remembrance, its oil dries out." The student asked, "How will I know when the light is strong?" Ibn Arabi smiled and said, "When your silence begins to speak louder than your words. When your heart trembles at a single name of Allah. When you begin to feel peace even in pain, that is when the light has taken root." Days turned into months, and those who prayed beside the student began to notice something strange. His face seemed calm even during hardship. His eyes reflected a kind of stillness that words could not describe. He no longer reacted to anger, envy, or fear the way others did. And soon people began saying, "There's something about him, as if he carries the dawn inside." When they asked Ibn Arabi about it, he simply replied, "He carries what every believer was meant to carry, the reflection of Allah's names." Then one night, as the wind whispered through the desert, Ibn Arabi gathered his students and said, "If you seek miracles, you have already missed them. The real miracle is to transform darkness into light inside your chest. The one who does that, even once, becomes proof of Allah's mercy walking on earth." That night was unlike any other. Ibn Arabi led his students outside beneath the endless desert sky, where the stars shimmered like droplets of divine ink scattered across eternity. "Look up," he said softly. "Every star you see is a reflection of a heart that remembered Allah." The wind carried his words through the silence as if even the desert was listening. "The same way these stars pierce the night," he continued, "the heart that carries the light of remembrance pierces the darkness of this world." Then he turned to his students and said something they would never forget: "The last verses of Surah Al-Hashr are not meant only to be heard, they are meant to awaken what has been asleep inside you." He explained that every time a believer recites those verses with full presence, the soul begins to remember its origin, the covenant it once made with Allah before birth. "Your heart whispers back," he said, "Yes, I knew you before the world began." That is why these verses carry peace, because they return you to the moment your soul first recognized its Lord. One of the younger students, trembling with awe, asked, "Master, what happens when a person's heart becomes filled with that light completely?" Ibn Arabi closed his eyes and replied, "Then their presence becomes prayer, their silence becomes dhikr, their breath becomes mercy. They stop speaking of Allah and start speaking through Him." The group sat in silence. Some wept. Others simply looked at the sky, feeling the meaning of his words without needing to understand them. "When you recite those verses tonight," Ibn Arabi said finally, "do not rush. Let every word sink into your chest. Say them until you can feel your heart breathing with them. That is when you will realize it was never you who recited the verses. It was always Allah allowing His names to echo through you." Then he looked toward the horizon, where dawn was beginning to touch the sands with light, and whispered, "And whoever carries that light in their heart, carries the proof that Allah never leaves His servants in darkness." The sun began to rise slowly, spilling gold across the horizon, painting the dunes in a glow that seemed almost sacred. Ibn Arabi remained seated, eyes half closed, face calm as if he was listening to something far beyond human hearing. His students watched in silence, their hearts trembling from the weight of his words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely louder than the morning wind. "The light that these verses awaken," he said, "is not only for peace, it is for guidance. It will lead you through every confusion, through loss, through fear. Because once Allah's light enters the heart, it becomes impossible to be truly lost again." The youngest student asked softly, "Master, what if the light fades?" Ibn Arabi smiled gently, his eyes reflecting the newborn sunlight. "The light never fades," he said. "Only the dust of this world covers it. Sins, worries, distractions, they cloud the lamp, but the flame inside still burns. Cleanse your heart through remembrance, and you will see it shine again." Then he picked up a small handful of sand and let it flow slowly through his fingers. "The world is like this sand," he said. "It slips through your grasp. But the light of Allah, if you hold it within, stays even when everything else is gone." The students sat quietly, feeling the truth of his words settle into their chests. The student who had first recited the verses whispered, "Master, I feel something new in my prayers now. As if Allah is not far above me, but right here, within me." Ibn Arabi looked at him with warmth. "That," he said, "is the beginning of real faith. Not fear of being far, but certainty of being near." Then, with his voice now filled with that familiar strength, he declared, "Remember this, the one who recites with love finds doors where others see walls. The one who remembers Allah in stillness finds movement within silence. And the one who carries light in his heart becomes a mirror, through which others may find their way." The students lowered their heads, some whispering prayers, others silently crying. The desert had gone silent again, but this time it wasn't emptiness, it was peace. As the sun fully rose, Ibn Arabi looked at his students one last time and said, "Recite. Remember. And when your heart begins to glow, do not think it is your doing. It is Allah reminding you, I was always here." That morning marked a turning point for every soul that sat with him beneath the rising sun. From that day forward, they no longer sought miracles, for they understood that the greatest miracle had already begun inside them, the awakening of the heart. Ibn Arabi's presence grew quieter with each passing season, but his light, the serenity that surrounded him, only deepened. People began traveling from distant lands to hear him speak, yet often he would say very little. He would simply look at them, and somehow their burdens felt lighter. One night, when the moon was full and the air still, a young scholar approached him. "Master," he said, "I have memorized the Qur'an, I know the hadith, I have studied the law, yet my heart feels heavy. What is missing?" Ibn Arabi smiled faintly, "You have filled your mind, but your heart is still hungry. Feed it with remembrance, and it will understand what books cannot teach." Then he told him to recite the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr for 40 nights straight, not as obligation but as communion. "Do not rush," he said. "Let the names sink into your breath. Let them reshape your silence." The scholar obeyed. Days turned to weeks, and somewhere between repetition and surrender, he began to understand. On the 40th night, as he recited, tears came uninvited. His chest felt lighter, his fear gone. It was as though every verse was washing him clean. He ran back to Ibn Arabi at dawn and said, "Master, something inside me has opened. I cannot explain it." Ibn Arabi's eyes softened, "You don't have to. The one who tastes honey no longer needs to describe sweetness." He placed his hand over the young man's heart. "Remember this," he whispered, "the light you feel is not new. It was always there. The verses didn't bring it, they revealed it." Then he looked out toward the desert horizon, glowing with morning light, and said, "When the heart is polished with remembrance, it begins to reflect the mercy of its Maker. And whoever carries that reflection walks through this world as a lantern for others." His disciples sat in silence, overwhelmed by the truth in his words. Ibn Arabi closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and said, "And that, my students, is the secret of Surah Al-Hashr, not that it changes Allah's world, but that it changes yours." The next few days were filled with an unusual stillness. The disciples felt as though something invisible had shifted in the air around them. Every prayer felt heavier, every breath deeper, every silence alive. Ibn Arabi spent those days walking alone through the desert, his steps slow, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The students followed him at a distance, afraid to disturb whatever sacred conversation seemed to unfold between him and the unseen. One evening, as the last light of day faded into gold, he stopped and said softly, "Listen. Even the wind is reciting." They strained their ears, and indeed, the wind hummed faintly through the dunes, like a chant too ancient to decipher. He smiled and continued, "Everything in creation remembers Allah. The rocks, the sand, the sky. You were never meant to teach the world dhikr, you were meant to join it." His words carried across the silence like a wave. "When you recite the names of Allah," he said, "you do not add your voice to the world, you return it. Because the soul was created from remembrance, and every act of dhikr is the soul coming home." He turned to them, his eyes shining with the reflection of the setting sun. "Do you understand now?" he said. "When you recite the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr, you are not asking for light. You are remembering that you already are light." One of the students whispered, "Master, how can we carry this light without pride?" Ibn Arabi smiled, "By never saying it is mine. The lamp does not claim ownership of the flame. It only holds it." That night, they returned to their small courtyard. The moon rose high, casting silver light across the ground. They sat in a circle, as they always did, but the air felt different, softer, heavier, sacred. Ibn Arabi began to recite the verses again, his voice low, his tone steady. "He is Allah, other than whom there is no deity." The sound filled the air, weaving through the night until the stars seemed to shimmer in rhythm. The students closed their eyes. Some wept quietly, others smiled through tears. When he finished, the silence that followed felt like the world had stopped breathing. Then he whispered, "Do you feel it now?" The message was never in the words. It was in the stillness after them. And in that stillness, each of them understood, not through reason, but through something far deeper, that they were no longer seekers. They were found. For a long time after that night, no one spoke. The disciples simply sat beneath the wide, silver moon, their hearts open, their souls trembling with the strange sweetness of presence. The air itself felt alive. Ibn Arabi looked at them and smiled faintly, knowing that what had been planted in their hearts would now grow for the rest of their lives. "You see," he said at last, "remembrance is not repetition. It is recognition. When the heart remembers Allah, it recognizes its origin, like a child remembering its mother's voice after being lost." His words hung in the air, gentle and infinite. "You were never far," he said. "You only forgot." He looked at each of his students with eyes that seemed to hold both worlds, the seen and the unseen. "When you recite these verses, you are not calling upon a distant God," he said softly. "You are awakening what has always been within you. The divine is not above or beyond. He is nearer to you than your own breath. Then he stood, his robe flowing in the soft desert wind, and raised his hands to the sky. "O Allah," he whispered, "let these hearts never forget what they felt tonight." His voice trembled not with weakness, but with awe. "Let them carry your names not as words, but as light. Let their lives become a verse in your endless recitation." The disciples began to weep quietly, overwhelmed by the purity of the moment. One of them said through tears, "Master, what do we do now?" Ibn Arabi turned to him and said, "Now, you live what you've learned. Speak less. Listen more. And when the world tries to cover your light, remember that even the smallest lamp can guide a lost traveler through the night." He began walking back toward the city, his steps slow but steady. The students followed in silence, the sound of sand crunching beneath their feet blending with the faint rhythm of Subhanallah that seemed to rise from the earth itself. When they reached the edge of the village, Ibn Arabi stopped and looked back one last time at the vast horizon. "Do not fear the darkness," he said. "It only exists to make the light visible." That night, as the students lay awake, none of them could sleep. They felt as though they had witnessed something beyond time, something that would echo in their hearts forever. And from that night onward, every time they recited the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr, they no longer asked for blessings. They simply said, "Thank you for letting me remember." Years later, people would speak of that gathering as if it had been touched by heaven. Some said they still felt a strange peace whenever those verses were read aloud, as if the desert itself still remembered the voice of Ibn Arabi in the night when the world seemed to pause to listen. And in that memory lived his final teaching, that light is not given to you. It is revealed within you, and remembrance is the key that unlocks it. As the years passed, Ibn Arabi's students carried his light to every corner of the world. They built no monuments, no marble tombs, no golden shrines, because he had told them, "If I live in your remembrance of Allah, then I never died." His words became seeds, scattered by the winds of time, growing quietly in hearts that had never seen his face but somehow felt his presence. Travelers spoke of men and women who radiated peace wherever they went, whose words calmed storms inside the souls of others. When they were asked where they had learned such wisdom, they would simply say, "From the one who taught us that Allah is not to be found, but remembered." One night, long after his passing, an old disciple sat alone under the same desert sky where they had once gathered. He whispered the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr just as his teacher had taught him. His voice was weak, his body frail, but his heart burned with a steady glow. And as he recited the final name, "He is the exalted in might, the wise," he felt it again, that same warmth, that same peace, that same nearness. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Master, I understand now." For in that moment, he realized that the verses had never left him, they had become him. The remembrance had outlived the reciter. The light had become the legacy. And as his final breath mingled with the cool desert air, the world seemed to grow still once more, like the night it all began. The wind carried his last whisper, so faint yet so eternal, "Whoever remembers Allah with love never truly dies." Somewhere, far beyond the veil, the teacher and the student met again, not in words, not in form, but in the light of remembrance that has no end. And thus the story closed as it began, with silence, peace, and a truth that cannot fade. Every verse, every test, every moment of longing is a door back to him. The light is within you. The remembrance is the key. And above all, as Ibn Arabi once wrote in the final line of his journal, "There is no distance between the seeker and the beloved, only forgetfulness. Remember, and you are already home."